Good evening and welcome to the March 21st, 2024 joint special hybrid meeting of the Park and Rec Commission and Open Space Conservancy Trust. My name is Peter Struck and I'm currently the Park and Rec Commission Chair. Open Space Conservancy Trust Chair Geraldine Poor sitting next to me and will co-chair the meeting tonight with me. Tonight's hybrid joint meeting is in person at the Mercer Island Community and Events Center, and we are also using video conferencing technology provided by Zoom. The Zoom video of this meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded to the city's YouTube channel later this week. Other public audience members are listening to the meeting by telephone or via the internet. Additionally, the city has opened up the community center to provide public space for viewing and participating in the meeting. Welcome to all, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Trustees, please have your microphone turned on for the roll call. And will city staff please call the roll for the Open Space Conservancy Trust?
Thank you, Chair. Chair Poor.
Here.
Vice Chair Ete.
Here.
Secretary Bender. Trustee Burseth.
Here.
Trustee Olson.
Here.
Council Liaison Anderl.
Here.
Trustee Hildebrand.
Here.
Thank you, Chair.
Nobody
Park-
called me, but I'm here also. Point of order.
We're just doing space now.
Oh,
You're
okay.
co- you're-
Okay, there we go. Not paying attention.
Park and Rec Commissioners, please have your microphones turned on for the roll call. And I'll ask the city staff to please call a roll for the Parks and Recreation Commission.
Thank you, Chair. Chair Struck.
Here.
Vice Chair Burstein.
Here.
Commissioner McCarthy.
Here.
Commissioner Westberg.
Roy?
Commissioner Westberg.
He's
I
frozen.
think he's frozen.
Yeah.
How would you like me to proceed, Chair?
Is that everybody?
Commissioner Cohen.
Here.
Commissioner Markson.
Here.
Commissioner Hay.
Here.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, well, we will recognize that Commissioner Westberg is in attendance. Thank you. Our first public item of business is public appearances. And are there any public appearances that have been signed up?
No, there are not, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Everyone good?
We're-
Done.
yeah,
Ready for
yeah.
4. Okay. Thank you. The only item of special business is the open space zone discussion, and we welcome City Manager Jesse Bond.
Bad start. Mic's not working. Good evening, everybody. I am Jesse Bond. I'm your city manager. We are going to be doing a workshop style discussion today. So we've brought out the flip charts and we will, let's see, just looking at, yeah, I think the flip charts are in an okay location. So I'm going to be moving around a bit. I'll just remind you again, the folks online can't hear us if we're not speaking into our mic, and that's the same for our audio and video recording. We need that. We have a couple extra mics floating around that we'll use. I'm not going to introduce all the staff, but when they speak, they will tell you who they are and their job. Thank you for being here. This is the first time we have done a joint meeting since we moved into this space. You can tell we're a little cramped, so thanks for making it work. Some treats on the table. If you forget to use your mic, I'm going to come take a treat away from you. That will be our, no, I'm kidding. All right. Just to kick it off, I do have a couple slides, and I'm probably driving you nuts, Raven, because I'm moving around, but don't worry about capturing me on the camera. And welcome to the rest of the trust who is joining us. We've had Marie and Jerry at the last couple of meetings. There we go. I promise you, for those of you that have seen this slide deck, there's just a handful this time to set the stage for our discussion this evening. So let's go ahead And next one. All right, so I will just remind everyone that the city council, we have 2 representatives here this evening, is underway with a comprehensive plan periodic update. That's just fancy lingo for every 10 years. We take a look at the whole plan and do a periodic update. It's required by state law. This year's update, we actually started in 2021, so it's a pretty major undertaking. We're looking at housing, we're looking at economic development, many charges handed down to us from the state. But the council also included development of a new park zone in the comprehensive plan. So that's what brought us here tonight. Next slide, please. We have been left, right, sideways on the new zoning work. But where we landed at the last meeting was to split the work into 2 new zones. So tonight, what we're going to be talking about is the development of an open space zone specific to properties that are open spaces on Mercer Island. That leaves for us a whole nother body of work that will continue into the spring and really probably through the end of this year, possibly into next, to address zoning for the rest of the parks properties. So tonight, we're just going to be talking about the open space properties. For a new zone to be effective, and these pieces will come later, and legal, essentially, and implementable, we have to have the code. Tonight, we're going to be talking about code language. We have to have a new updated zoning map, and we have to have a new land use map. So tonight, we're just going to talk about the words. The staff will deal with the maps later. That will probably come back to you at the next meeting. All right, next slide, please. Just a reminder, and actually everyone, both boards in this room tonight worked on the 2022 PROS plan. I harp on this a lot, but I'll remind you that the foundation of the zoning work is your PROS plan. The PROS plan is your guiding policy document. So as we're talking about subjects tonight, I know I have the PROS plan open on my computer. I have staff that are ready to pull references, but we should look back and remind ourselves what it says. If something needs to be further researched, if we just don't have time to get to it, the staff will take care of that between now and the next meeting. All right, next slide. You've seen this slide before. One of the places that we refer to in the PROS plan is Chapter 4. That's where all of your goals and objectives are located. That's where we got a little more specific about what we wanted to see in our park system, and that included topics that relate to open space that we'll be talking about tonight. Next slide, please. Speaking of, in your packet, these are the open space properties on Mercer Island. We've amended the table. I think you got an email from Ryan Daly today. We left out the acreage, so that was added. You can't read that really on the screen, but we wanted to make sure you had reference to it. We are still working on the maps, so you can see where all these properties lie, and we'll be prepared to share a map tonight if that's helpful. And next slide, please. All right, the work begins then. So there are 5 components of a zoning code. These were in your staff report. This is going to guide our discussion this evening. I want to just say this, don't worry about wordsmithing. Somehow between this meeting and the next one, the staff will get together and take all of your feedback and put together a draft zoning code for your consideration at the next meeting. What I'd like to challenge you to do tonight is point to where there is consensus. We'll start by talking about the purpose statement. Then we'll talk about the conditions. How do we define the lands that go into the open space zone? We'll begin talking about allowable uses. What types of activities can happen in an open space zone, and then we'll talk about development standards. I think as I just rattled that off, you're probably thinking this is going to be really complicated. I don't want you to worry so much about where the things go in the buckets. I will sort that out later. So if we're going to talk about parking, for example, I'm sure that's on our list of things to talk about tonight. Don't worry if it goes in number 3 or number 4. We'll deal with that later. I think the more substantive discussion tonight is just, what do we think about parking? Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions? If I think Peter and Jerry are going to be co-chairing tonight. If I need more information, I'm going to help facilitate. If there's disagreement, let's work through it and talk and really try to find out where we do agree as a starting place. I don't expect to get through everything tonight, but at least we'll get started. And just a reminder, we're looking for the ideas, themes, words. We've got flip charts, and then we will be taking all of that and putting it into a draft code for your next meeting. Okay, looks like Councilmember Reynolds has a quick question.
Just one quick one, and I'm not sure if it has a substantive impact or not, but I'd like to know. You're referring to this as the open space zone. Is it a separate thing from the park zone, or is this like a sub thing of a park zone that includes both other developed parks and open space?
It looks like we're headed to two separate zones.
Okay,
It's just a little cleaner and simpler on the actual regulation writing side. If that direction changes, I will tell you by the next meeting, but I think that's where we landed as staff. And I'm calling it the open space zone. By the next time you see us, we will actually have a name. It may still be open space zone, but there's some nuances to naming your zones, and we still need to work through that. So with that, both of our chairs, we thought we would start with a discussion around the table of the purpose. This is largely, how do you define open space? And I think Carson, in our back slides here, we have some text that we took from the Open Space Conservancy Trust documents that might get you thinking. I'm going to have my team members come up with pens, and we'll start just jotting down ideas. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, City Manager. Yeah, so we'll try to have a open discussion as Jesse mentioned. Again, we're not going to get into wordsmithing. It's just really getting ideas down and trying to get a consensus, and then we'll let staff take all the ideas and turn it into a cohesive, cogent type document. So as was mentioned, the first is that kind of that purpose statement, or what do we want to say? What is the purpose of this zone is really what we're at. So again, we probably all have a somewhat of a definition or view of what open space is. Obviously, we've got some on the screen up there for open space. So start with that perhaps, is looking at that, what's the definition on the screen, does that fully comprehend, entail what we think about it? Are there things missing, or should we take things out? Trustee Bender.
I mean, I like that definition. But I did also look at the definition of open space in the Mercer Island City Code. They obviously have to be aligned. And there's actually some things in the Mercer Island Code that I am not really supportive of, so I prefer this definition.
I have good news. Once we update the definition, likely the other definitions in the code will also be updated and reconciled. Yeah.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So
Councilman Randall.
thanks, Maria. I didn't look at the code. Is there something in particular that's jumping out at you in terms of allowed uses or something that we should be talking a little bit further about, or?
No, I don't think so. It's more focused on the purpose. And so the code has, for example, a purpose that is to provide visual contrast to continuous development, reinforce community identity and aesthetics. And I'm kind of not fully supportive of that concept of purpose.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Are there other, Commissioner Cohen?
I didn't remember, and I wondered how picnicking got in there, which seems okay for some areas, but maybe not so much for other areas. So that was the only thing that jumped out to me, other than, I don't know, I keep focusing on if retained, because it suggested to me that somebody was thinking about getting rid of it, but I understand the purpose of that one. But picnicking, I wasn't sure about.
Oh, go ahead, Thomas.
Yes, I think in general, a definition is stronger if it incorporates fewer words. So if we can distill the statement to its essence without going into wordsmithing, I would give general direction to try to make it more concise. And if we wanted to point out the particulars that we consider to be the essence, that would be appropriate, I believe. I think undisturbed or not currently developed is one of those essential elements, and the idea behind low impact uses and generally leaving the property and then in an undeveloped state and a natural state so that it can have native species and things like that. So that would be the two main items that I would bring to the fore.
Thank you. Commissioner or Councilmember Reynolds.
I'm not going to take a stand on this either way, but I'm going to just mention that recognizing that the 30 things listed in the bottom line are examples and not intended to be exclusive, there are two other uses that might be worth explicitly mentioning because they're sometimes done now and might not be viewed as low impact. And that would be bike riding and horseback riding. And I think you should probably take a stand on that one way or another.
Thanks. You covered my issue.
All right.
Marie.
So, I mean, Don, you sort of touched on something I wanted to bring up at some point anyway, which is a question about how you structure things. Because I agree, some open spaces are appropriate for some uses, but not other uses. And another good example is where are, off-leash dogs appropriate and not appropriate? And so my question is, how do you build a zoning code that has a laundry list of permitted things and then allow subsequent elaboration about which of those are okay in this particular space, but not in that space?
It's a great question. So right now we're on the purpose, right? I would encourage you to be up a level and try to find terms that more broadly describe what open space is. When we get down into the next couple phases of discussion here, we are going to be talking about allowed uses. Again, I think one of the challenge, especially for those of you that were on the front side of this process when the first draft zone rolled out, is what should be addressed in zoning and what should be addressed by separate park policy. So prohibiting horses, I'm going to use an extreme example, or allowing horses may not be something that you want to call out in the code, but it's something we need to deal with then at the next layer, which is parks operating policies. And certainly for those of you that are here from the trust, you steward those rules for Pioneer Park and Engstrom. What I don't want to do, I'm going to strongly encourage you not to create things that result in non-conforming situations. Right, that's part of the reason we're here tonight, to kind of wrestle that down. So if horses are already allowed in open space, right, making this up, we may not want to prohibit them here. So that's the way I think about it, or at least we need to understand the conflicts we're creating. Does that help? Okay.
I'll just be a voice to say that I also generally support this and agree, as Trustee Hildebrandt pointed out, and Trustee Bender, the passive and low impact forms seem appropriate to me. And yeah, and not to get into too much detail, but the undeveloped nature, I think we do want to recognize the trails that go through and benches and signage that we do have in, for example, in Pioneer Park. Not to call it out in the purpose, but just that is some form of development.
If I could take a turn, a couple of words that I would think should be in there, and that is preserve and protect. I look at the current definition that we're working with where we say maintain and enhance. I just think preserve and protect is a little bit stronger language. So I'm not exactly sure where you would put it there, but I just think that concept has been used a couple of times in our discussions.
So Chair, I might suggest, since this, we pulled this definition as a starting point, thanks to Trustee Bender for flagging this for us at the last meeting. I might suggest we take out the specifics of walking, jogging, and picnicking, going back to Councilmember Reynolds' point. The words "if retained" don't really apply in the zoning code necessarily. It sounds like we may try to be a little more concise. What else? I was pulling up the pros plan to see if it had any other words of wisdom literally to share here. Yeah.
Oh,
Did you want us to bring it back up?
Trustee Ate.
okay.
Thank you. Jesse, I don't know if this is getting too much in the weeds, but I wonder if it would make sense for us to include something about the maintaining of ecosystem health in the open spaces, especially when considering all of the forest health issues that we're dealing with and managing with root rots and tree health. So I think and we might want to explicitly address that. And I don't know if this is the space to do that, but there is active management that we need to do in that effort. So I wonder if it's important that we address that there is active management of these systems. That's not just left to be. Yes. So I just pulled up, gosh, what page am I on? I'm on page 97 in chapter 9 of the pros plan. And there's a whole paragraph here that talks about, this is the open space chapter, protecting habitat, providing ecological services. Also, you might recall, I recall this discussion, educational and stewardship opportunities was something both boards valued when we were working on this chapter. Looking at this text, are there words that jump out to you that were missing from that earlier definition? I think the comments about habitat and stewardship are well taken.
Commissioner McCarthy.
Thank you. Just looking at over at page 92, I like there's a sentence here. It says these open space lands are managed to conserve and restore ecosystem functions, native vegetation and wildlife habitat. I like that sentence and what it conveys. It's the second paragraph on 92. It's in the middle of mine.
Oh. Oh, I'm on it. I'm on the.
Yeah, it's like the chapter 9 opening page.
There we go.
Yeah,
There.
yeah, right there. I just like that feeling about what was said before about it being an actively managed to preserve what we have. Thanks.
Oh. And sorry, I was on the wrong page. Open space may refer to public properties that are exclusively natural areas or portions of larger parks that are managed as natural areas. This is the more updated list of some things that may be included. And
So,
then,
yeah, so just after restrooms, that sentence.
yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, go.
One
Okay.
more comment, one more comment about this issue.
That mic right in front of you.
I beg your pardon?
There.
Yeah, I think there really is a need to address this issue with, and I don't care what the wording is, but I think up to this point, it sounds like it's kind of a passive activity on our part of just kind of keeping the status quo. And I think it's very clear to us that there's a need for there to be an active component in order to, whether you call it restore or assist in these areas thriving within some of the challenges that are now occurring. So and I don't want to wordsmith, but I do think we need to include that concept that there's, a passive role as well as an active role.
Thank you for that. One other thought I had, and I saw this in a couple of other cities that have park zone language. And I don't think we have to have it specifically, but it says in the purpose was provides a distinct contrast to the built environment. Again, trying to say that this is natural. I think we probably say it already, but that's something that really has kind of stuck in my head of saying, as you draft, kind of think, well, yeah, how are we going to differentiate this zone from, let's call it, the recreation zone or other residential and so forth like that. Any final thoughts on, Commissioner Hay?
Yeah, along the same lines as what we're discussing, a word that I think is missing is conservation or conserved. We do use that word throughout the pros plan, calling open space conserved lands. So that gives as you were mentioning, it's more of an active process to conserve the lands. So I'd like that to be in there.
Trustee Hildebrandt?
Yes, I do have another comment. In terms of the purpose of the open space zone, I noticed some language in the code that gives a hierarchy of zoning, and I would like the open space zone to be placed at the very end of that hierarchy as a catch-all. So if there's no other zone designated for a particular piece of land, it automatically becomes open space. And there's even a situation where this might arise in the existing code, where if a street, for example, is abandoned or becomes disused, then currently it reverts to the zoning of the neighboring properties. But we would want to explicitly change that to reverting to open space. So that's an idea of a purpose that can be attached to the open space zone, and I'd like that to be considered.
So just to make sure I understand, so right now, the zoning map, I think everything is probably already has an existing zone. What you're suggesting is that if something was to happen and the existing zone perhaps is no longer appropriate, if that's the right term, then it would, other things being equal, it would default to this open space zone. Is that?
Yeah, that is essentially it.
Okay.
Or, if the lake recedes and there's new new land, then what do we call it? Yes. So
Commissioner Bursey.
Just for clarification, so the land that was acquired by the city at Southeast 40th and Island Crestway, which is now just open space, that would permanently become open space by your definition? Is that correct?
yeah, that's more or less my intent. If it has no other zoning attached to it, that it would automatically acquire the open space zoning. And
so if I can follow up, one thing with the problem with automatically reverting to open space is properties like that may have a longer range purpose within that acquisition or within abandonment that now can serve another purpose. So for an example, if an adjacent property to Luther Burbank would suddenly become vacant and unusable for whatever reason, that little pocket would be open space. That might be more problematic for managing Luther Burbank as a whole.
City Manager Bond.
I think this will be. By the end of the meeting, I'll have the microphone sorted out. I think this will be a good item to follow up There are no properties on Mercer Island that aren't zoned. Zoning is an active process in the city, and changing zoning is an active process. So the parcel you just described that we acquired on 40th, I don't think we've rezoned it. It's still residential. And the city would not support things automatically defaulting to open space. That property was acquired with transportation purpose in mind. However, I think maybe what you might be getting after is when no other home exists for a public asset, that it could possibly be incorporated into the open space zone for retention as conservation, that might be, that we make space for those other things that might pop up in that way. Is that maybe another way to look at it?
Yes, also, there are some parcels of land on the island which are owned by the, or I'm not sure particularly about ownership, but at least they are managed by the State Department of Transportation. And so if that land were to be ceded to the island, it would automatically become open space. But then, since there is a process for determining changing of zones, it would basically be up to the city council to say, well, no, it looks like parkland to us, so let's make it parkland, or no, it's right next to houses, let's make it R15 or whatever. So it would just give a starting place.
Commissioner Cohen, thank you.
I don't have a view on Tom's point because I'm still trying to understand it. So I don't have a view on that one, but I favor some of the suggestions of deleting the specifics at the end. I favor deleting if retained. I favor adding in restore to preserve and protect so that it gives you that more active thing. I think, Ashley, to your point, conservation is, at least the word conservation is in here. It may not be what you had in mind, but other than those things, I'm generally okay with this definition. So, for this purpose, sorry.
Anybody else have any kind of general thoughts along what Commissioner Cohen just said? If there's things that are, you really want to make sure they're in there, or if there's things that you kind of say, well. Sarah? Oh,
Yeah.
Marks, oh, there you are. Thank you.
I like what Commissioner Cohen said. I think the only thing he didn't say that I would add is I like the idea of saying something similar to what the pros plan said, and I think it was said earlier that it supports what do we have, like ecosystem benefits or ecological function. And like when I'm saying that, I'm thinking of, you know, I would assume many people in Mercer Island love the owls in the parks, and part of having owls in the parks means you have to have an ecological system that supports them. So anyway, I would support using terms such as that in the purpose of the open space. Thanks. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Can you hear me okay in there? I'm
We're
curious.
getting a lot of echo.
Oh, shoot.
If everyone
Okay.
could just double check that your speakers are off. We are getting some feedback and I'm not sure where it's coming from. We'll keep troubleshooting on our end. We could hear you, Commissioner Marks, and we just heard
Yeah.
you twice.
I'll just add the
Oh, no, go ahead.
page, you shared a page which might have been 97 and pulled out some other uses. And I think as we get into the discussion of uses, that would be good to revisit.
Councilmember Reynolds.
Great discussion so far. Good job. One thing I noted that is not listed on the uses that I saw that you might want to think about is carbon sequestration. Or purposes more than uses, yes.
I think the appetite is to move on from the purpose statement to our next category.
Okay.
All right.
And the next one is conditions required for land being included within the zone. What criteria is used to determine if land is included in the open space zone?
So I'm a little concerned that a lightning bolt is going to strike my head when I show this document, but I'm going to show the earlier draft of the park zone to give you an idea of what we're looking for here. I actually think it's pretty simple. Famous last words. All right, so this section, let's see, are you seeing my screen? Yep. This section right here was from the earlier draft of the code. So our draft zone that we'll be bringing back to you will probably include this text. Lands must meet the following designation requirements to qualify for classification as, and we'll switch that out with open space zone. And this was something we wrestled with a lot. We originally had a public park property. Then we changed it to lands must be owned, leased, or maybe managed by the city of Mercer Island. We were trying to pick up Pioneer Park and Inkstrom. I think this category, just to get you thinking, generally describes public properties owned by the city of Mercer Island. So I think the question is, and Allison Van Gorp is here from the planning department virtually, and Eileen Kiefer is here, outside legal counsel. They can probably also help us talk more about this category. If you don't want to spend a lot of time on this one, that's perfectly acceptable. The staff can actually work on this, but I wanted to at least share it with you.
Okay, anybody have any comments? One thing, I'm looking at these, by saying designating that, you know, these types of lands that are identified on this sheet of paper within the pros plan automatically, I don't know, maybe not automatically, but would be included as, or designated, so forth. And I think that also then brings up a question about in the pros plan, there's other areas, for example, Upper Luther Burbank, that I think many would consider as open space, but it's not on this list. And I think there's probably other areas too, and we might want to.
Last one.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Right. But I think there are other areas, for example, at Island Crest.
So the first part of that question, I think, was, can we just reference
Yeah.
back to a document like that?
All right.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we are putting in front of you the recommended list of properties that would be initially included in this zone. Remember, zoning is active, so the council can add additional properties or parcels to the open space zone in the future. This is the initial list. These are clearly, Elaine, I'm going to say it like 100% open space properties. They're designated open space in all of our planning documents. Part two of that is, what about all the other open space areas that are in parks? I think we're going to have to deal with those in part two of our work. And I'm not quite sure yet how we tackle that. And Island Crest Park, for example, your open space is primarily, let's call it on the edge, on the perimeter of that park. But we have other parks where the open space areas are actually right in the middle. So my recommendation, those are going to get a little more complicated. I would take those as part two. I think for this purpose of this zoning exercise, I would take that entire list.
So to your question about future additions to the park zone, I'm looking at number 1, where it says the city council must adopt findings. So could there be a proposal before the city council we would like to adopt these additional properties to be included in the zone? And that would be basically the way it would work?
That's correct. Again, I may look to either Eileen or Allison to help with this, but typically when the council is considering rezoning, there's a whole legislative process that happens, much like what we're doing right now. They're presented with materials or findings that explain why that property qualifies to be considered under that zone. So if something's not on the list today, but we determine in a future process, whether that's next year or in 10 years, that would be the process for that parcel to be considered for rezoning or multiple parcels.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, findings is a technical term or a legal term. Yes, Eileen, see, I'm doing okay, Eileen. For the record, Eileen is nodding that I am doing okay.
Yes, for the record, Eileen Kiefer, Madrona Law Group, we sort of serve as the city's contract assistant city attorney, helping out when BO doesn't have capacity. You've got that exactly right, city manager bond findings. The council members will remember them from like development regulations when you make particular findings of fact. And so that would be something that would be needed to be baked into the zoning process.
I have a question. May I? So is it useful to talk, for under number 2, to talk about, impervious surfaces? Like whether that should be a criteria for either no impervious surfaces or minimal, to support monuments and benches or something like that? Or does that just unnecessarily complicate things?
You're unnecessarily complicating things.
Fine. See, I gave
I'm
you
going to
the
take a chocolate, no.
route. Take it.
We should come back to that. I think the uses permitted and the development regulations are gonna get into that topic much more.
Okay.
A little humor today.
Yeah.
Trustee Bender.
So just a clarification, the city documents currently have all of these listed as open space. Does that mean the city council doesn't need to have findings as sort of de facto open space? Or are we gonna have to do findings for each of these?
We will, once we draft the zoning,
Okay.
this is a new zone, okay, and zoning's active, so the recommendation that you'll be handing off to the planning commission will include not only new code, new maps, and also the list of properties to be considered to be rezoned. And we will have done our work with our attorneys to make sure the properties that we're recommending meet what we're working on tonight, all of the code language. And that will be part of the findings.
Okay, so then would it be appropriate to include a recommendation that Island Crest be considered for open space designation for that portion where the trails are?
Not at this time, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Okay. Zoning requires a tremendous amount of precision. So we have to know what it is that is being included in that zone. Island Crest Park, although it's actually set up for that open space to be cleaved off, it's not yet. It's one big parcel. So in the time we have, I cannot deliver on that, but I know it's important to many of you that we take a look at Island Crest Park and the other properties that include open space. So we haven't forgotten it. It's just going to take a little more work.
Just to respond to Marie, I think though we can, as a group, in our transmittal memo, say something that we strongly support further work on this, and, you know, whether that's 25 or whenever that will get happen. So, Councilmember Reynolds.
Yeah, I'm just gonna note that I'm not sure I know what B1 means. I'm not sure I know what it means for a classification to be consistent with the purpose. And I think what it may mean is, and might be more clearly stated, and sorry for wordsmithing a little bit, is that the characteristics and uses of the land are consistent with the purpose of the park zone or something like that. I don't know how the classification itself can be consistent.
Eileen, do you have any thoughts on that word in particular, classification? I feel like sometimes these are from other parts of our code.
Not off the top of my head. I'd have to look at the other zones and kind of look and see how they're, how that treats this particular portion. But I mean, I think what we'd be looking for here are the basic characteristics for any particular property to be included in the zone. This is obviously from the previous iteration of the park zone. So it says, I think the biggest piece of this would have been the land must be owned, leased, or maybe managed by the city of Mercer Island, but we'd be looking for something that's specific to open space, something that, you know, kind of makes open space and therefore appropriate for classification as open space zoned.
I see Allison Van Gort popped on screen. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of meeting Allison yet. She's our deputy director in our planning department.
Hello, good evening. Yeah, I was just gonna agree with Eileen. I think and the mute keeps turning on. I'm not sure why. What it's looking for is, trying to align with that purpose statement and making sure that any properties that are proposed for the open space zone would align with that purpose. And, I think what Eileen said, open space is open space. And so we'd be looking for those characteristics that fit within that definition and that purpose.
Craig, maybe this is what you're getting at. Instead of saying consistent with the purpose, say consistent with the definition of open space. Because isn't that the reason we put together a definition?
I was actually thinking the other way, that we want it to be consistent with the purpose of the open space. But the question is, what's consistent with it? And I think it's the plot of land is, if the city were to buy the QFC, we wouldn't want to say, we're going to make that open space because that's not what that land is, and somehow we have to say something about the land makes it fit the open space.
Commissioner Cohen.
I went in the last week or so and looked at some of these properties that I'm not as familiar with than others. And I just had a historical question, like Salem Woods, for example, that's owned by the city. And that came from what? From the development of it originally, or the Hollerback? Where'd that come from? Because these are, they struck me as being similar, but much smaller than, for example, the half of Island Crest Park. And they weren't much different from some of the trails that were not, that we talked about last time, but that we're not dealing with now. So anybody know how that became? Is it owned, managed, or leased by the city?
Yes, so all of those are actually owned by the city. For the record, Elaine Summergren, Deputy Public Works Director. So all of those properties that you just mentioned, so the smaller ones, Salem Woods, and then Hollerbach, which is actually made up of a whole slew of parcels. I believe, I can't speak to the exact origin of all of them, but a lot of them were donated parcels from nearby developments, nearby landowners. That was undevelopable land, perhaps for tax reasons, but it was donated to the city, and the city deemed that it did serve a purpose, either as having ecosystem function, serving as a natural area, or potentially for a future connection trail that might connect a neighborhood to another portion of the island. So all of those came to the city and were evaluated by the city for that potential.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful just for context for me.
Trustee Hildebrand.
Yes, I've been thinking of the potential of increasing the inventory of open space on the island precisely because of the tax benefits that might accrue from a private landowner subdividing the property and petitioning council to rezone it as open space. So initially, that land would be owned by the property owner that was attempting to get it rezoned. This would occur before the title was transferred to the city if that was going to happen. So I think there needs to be provision for that. So you could say, well, in that case, it's not yet managed by the city. And that would be an interesting sort of catch-22 if I'm reading the sentence number 2 correctly. So we might want to remove that restriction, or at least consider removing that restriction to make it easier to add open space to the inventory on the island. And also I wanted to point out that there are a number of cut-through trails on the island, and I'm not sure how they're currently zoned, and would it be appropriate to consider those to be open space? Would we have conversations with the property owners that are adjacent there? And, well, I just mentioned this as a potential complication.
Yes, we're voting you off the island right now. No, great points. And trails came up at our last meeting. Trails are a very unique animal on the island. Some of the property we own, some of the property is tied up in easements. And so we made a decision that we needed to put that in the list of things we need to evaluate for the next phase of zoning. So I want to make sure I understood your comment. Was it to take out the requirement that it must be owned? And I'll say the intent of the zone is the zoning work was intended to be for public property.
I'm suggesting that open space per se need not necessarily be owned by the city. And whether or not it's managed by the city, that might be a fine point. But the zone by itself doesn't necessarily entail ownership by the city, that, in my view.
Is that a legal question
No,
at all, or is that just strictly zoning?
No, that's, I mean, a fun fact, the council can generally change the zoning of properties. Probably need to get back to you on that
Interesting, yeah.
and talk to the attorneys. We definitely have privately owned properties on Mercer Island that function like open space. Just need to think about, in fact, I need to go back to the guiding directive the council gave us to work on this zone and make sure, I think it applied to public parks. But let me follow up with that. And if nothing else, let's put it on the list of things that need to be addressed later.
May I comment? Jesse, as you were introducing this, you brought up the example of Pioneer Park, which is owned by the trust and not necessarily the city. And you explained that was why you were including managed or leased also, right? So that is somewhere on that spectrum.
That was why we added, in this earlier draft, we added the word managed by the city because we technically manage it on behalf of the trust. That word has been causing me grief a little bit because I've been thinking, what else do we manage that we don't necessarily own? But I think in the open space zone, the words are probably okay. In the park zone, okay, we'll work on later. I think we need to take a second look at that word.
Okay. Any other thoughts on the designation requirements? Oh, Councilmember Reynolds, thank you.
They relate to the example was given and city manager been asked me to comment on the Boys and Girls Club site. Because that includes a 242 square foot proposed open space easement. But I don't think the intent of the city manager that easement, and nor would we own it. So this definitions would not be included, I think. But
I think you're correct.
that easement is probably useless to the landowner.
Mhm.
If we structured it so that they can donate the land to the city and create open space, would that be something that we want to make sure is possible?
Well, am I voting you off the island now too? One of my bosses. Thinking out loud here, I think we may have gone beyond the scope of the initial mission, but the ideas you're sharing are really good and important. We may, I mean, I really think this might belong in the second phase of work because I'm just thinking practically to even between now and May, figure out where those parcels are. Typically with private ownership, it's unusual for the city just to rezone a property without a intentional conversation with property owners. But I think we should talk about it. And Councilmember Reynolds, the other thing is if the land is zoned open space, that's one thing. If the city's owns it, that's a whole nother conversation about maintenance and costs and things. So if the group will indulge me, I think it's worth talking more about this. I'm not sure we can address private open space properties in this round.
Generally agree with you guys. At some point, we should have a discussion about if the land is useless to the developers, they can get a tax deduction for donating to the city.
Absolutely.
Maybe there should be a process to encourage that. Something should be followed.
Yeah, and actually, you're on somewhere in the pros plan. Don't ask me to point to where it is, but we called out doing basically a land acquisition study where we would thoughtfully look at property on the island that might benefit the public parks and recreation system, including open space areas. That work's been probably deferred until the next biennium. But that's on our list of things to do. And I think that probably falls under this umbrella, right? If we're going to acquire it, what zone does it ultimately go in? So, okay.
Commissioner Bursting.
I have a question. What if the bike skills area had not gone in? And through this process, we designated that whole space as open space. Then later we found, hey, we really want to do this bike skills area, but this is designated open space. Would that even be possible? And how would we go about doing it if it is possible?
Someone else is getting voted off the island.
Oh, sorry.
Allison.
I have nobody else in the room.
Do we need a chocolate break? Okay, no, I'm just having a little fun tonight with all of you. So I'm going to ask Allison to help me out. The question is, if a property is zoned open space and we wanted to drop something like, let's take something a little easier, like a playground in there, and it's not an allowed use, what generally would our code say about how that could or could not be done?
I believe you would need to rezone the property, which would require docketing and then the whole rezoning process.
Is there a process for, and I know I'm putting you on the spot because we haven't written this hypothetical code yet, for variances on something like that?
Our code has very limited opportunities for variances, and they're typically only allowed on numerical standards. So like the side setback width, if it was not possible to build something with the required setback width, you could apply for a variance to reduce that width. But there's not variances for things like permitted uses.
That was going to be close to my answer, although not quite said as eloquently as Allison. So as we're thinking, as we go to the next topic, which is permitted uses, we do need to be thoughtful about what's allowed and by design what then is not allowed. Would you like to go to that topic next?
Can I just make one follow-up comment? I think that's the way it ought to be, because some of us expressed at the last meeting that concern that a future council, for whatever reason, might want to do exactly what you're talking about, for whatever good or not so good reason. So once it's in here, it ought to be tough to get it changed. Okay. So I don't think anybody needs to apologize about that.
Apology. And remember that the council can always amend your code, but that too goes through, I mean, look at very similar process to what we're doing right now. It's a full legislative review to change a code. So that's not easy either. All right, I'm going to scroll to this next section of the earlier draft code, but just to get you thinking, and then I'm going to stop screen sharing because this section really doesn't apply to the open space. This is the one where, and Ryan, if you want to hand your pen to somebody and take a turn, permitted uses. This is where we're describing the types of uses that would be allowed in the open space zone. And you can see in the earlier draft, we were pretty broad. This was for the park zone, so it's not apples to apples. Later on in the document, these terms were defined. So this was the earlier list. We used recreation a couple times, recreation facilities, there were buildings referenced. We're going to want to talk about public parking. Temporary uses, this allows for things like events to happen. Transit, art, signs, wireless facility, and utilities. And I have some team members here that would be happy to talk to you about wireless facilities and also the utilities, because there are issues with open space in both of those areas. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing.
Okay, Commissioner McCarthy.
I'm ready to hear about the wireless and utility.
Let's start with wireless. For those of you that were at our prior meetings, I'll just remind you that the city has another section of our code that relates to telecommunications facilities. Oh, did we lose our screen again? Oh, there we go. There's federal laws and other things that guide placement of telecommunications facilities. So Eileen can give you the high flyover.
Sure. Thank you, City Manager Bond. With telecommunication regs, basically that is regulated on a citywide basis in, I believe it's MICC Chapter 1906. And so any changes with respect to use of, I guess, open space or parks or any particular classification of property should really be looked at as a separate project and through looking at that provision altogether. City Manager Bond is absolutely correct. So telecommunications has been regulated by both the Congress and the FCC for decades, and it just keeps getting narrower and narrower and narrower as respect to local control. And so any changes, so even if you want to, we're looking narrowly right at just open space, that will have ripple effects from a legal perspective. And so my thought is that it really should be just a separate project. The additional thing too is that any changes we make can result in legal non-conforming uses. That can also be problematic. So I think luckily the staff's recommendation here is going to be kick the can down the road on that one and just kind of not prohibit this in the open space, but if council wants to take up revising the telecommunications code, that's something that certainly could be looked at another time. It would just involve quite a bit of legal review, quite a bit of analysis.
So Eileen, for the benefit of the group, if we don't name wireless communications facilities as an allowable use, it really doesn't matter because it's already an allowed use through it's potentially an allowed use through another section of the code in this very extensive process where antennas are sited. Is that?
Subject to check, and I'm going to also punt to Deputy Director Van Gorp on this one. Some cities do it differently, right? And so it's going to be, some cities have an allowed use table, and some cities will say, we're going to say where these things are allowed, and if it's not mentioned, then it's prohibited. It really kind of depends on the rest of the code and what that looks like. I'm hoping Deputy Director Van Gorp can speak to that a little more clearly, and I can also pull up the code real quick and see.
Any follow-up?
I was just pulling the code up as well. From memory, my belief is that those sections of code that pertain to both small wireless facilities and large wireless facilities provide that those could be cited kind of throughout the island, and they have their own set of rules about how and where that can happen.
So the issue with antennas, we talked about this at the last meeting, is I bet if I polled the room, all of you would say they don't belong in our parks. And yet I bet every single one of us has a cell phone on us or two right now. That is why this is a really tricky topic. The best I have come up with for you so far is to include, not to prohibit telecommunications facilities, because we would potentially create a legal problem in our code, which exposes us to issues and could actually result in our code being invalidated somehow. So my recommendation would instead be that if your feeling is you really would prefer that the last resort be an antenna in open space, that we put that in our recommendation memo. At some point in the future, we do have some code work to do on the telecommunications code. There's some updates that are coming. So that's just from your city manager. I'm open to other feedback you might have.
I have.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
As an alternative idea, because this is going to be a hot topic, whether it's in there or not in there. It's going to be a hot topic. I don't know if this works legally, but one could consider saying telecommunications facilities or wireless, whatever the wording is, but only if required by law and permitted by city code. Again, so I'm trying to give something that makes it, like you said, sort of last resort, but the last resort is only if it's required by law and it's permitted by the code. Again, it may not be legal or may not solve the problem.
Trustee Hildebrand.
I'd like to defer to the council here present. But I believe that if you say nothing in your local law, then the law of the larger government body will prevail. So we could just simply say nothing. And if the federal law requires us to allow the siting of wireless facilities within our open space, then so be it. Is that a correct assessment?
It's slightly more complicated than that. You're correct that federal law does indeed preempt and supersede any conflicts with state or local law. In the area of telecommunication regulation, the way you road test that is through court cases, frankly. The federal regulations do not say telecommunication device or telecommunication facilities are permitted in all residential zones throughout the country. They don't say that. They say cities, you can't prevent the siting of them. And then there's like a complex legal test that you go through to figure that out. So I wish there were such a scheme because it would make my life a lot easier. But like I said, the way you road test whether it's legal or not is through a court case. And I don't think that's perhaps how we want to road test that here. Looking at I did pull up the code, the telecommunications code, and it sort of like walks you through residential uses. This is where they're allowed. This is what they look like. Blah, blah, other zone. This is what they look like. So frankly, it seems like we're creating a new zone here, and that's going to have ripple effects. That's going to ripple into this chapter for certain. I think that's actually just going to be another project we have to take as a result of creating the open space zone, creating a park zone, because they're not addressed in that portion of the MICC. So I think for this group, it might make your life a little simpler of this is work that's going to have to come, but perhaps not appropriate for the creation of the zone itself.
Eileen, would it be appropriate for this group then, knowing that the creation of new zones means that the telecommunications code will pick that up, to make a recommendation like open space zone would be recommended as the lowest priority for siting these facilities?
I think that would be perfectly appropriate because that would inform future legislation on this topic. You guys have good work. You don't want to see that, fall off by the wayside, but you also can't do everything at once. So I think that's a great way to handle it.
Mr. Cole.
I kind of get it, but what's the matter with saying it's okay, but only if it's required by law and city code permits it? I'd realize that's shorthand, but I mean, if we say nothing, in here, in the code, in the open space zone about it. The city manager's gonna be, and the council's gonna be answering questions from the usual suspects all the time. All the time. Maybe that's just the nature of democracy. I don't know, but.
I think we could look at that code, what you're suggesting, Commissioner Cohen. I think we could look at that code language and also do what I just mentioned, which is recommend when that other code, the telecommunications code is updated, that open space be the lowest priority for citing the infrastructure.
Yes, I support that counter proposal.
As long as we have our elevator speech ready to address that, then that might be as much as we can do without getting into the morass of federal law and et cetera.
Marie, did you have something?
Yeah, I don't know how extensively you expect just a list of permitted things to be. So if I look at Pioneer Park, permitted things are bicycles. Although the board has adopted a rule about groups of bicycles and how big can they be in the park, just to protect the trails from being destroyed. Horses are allowed in the southeast only. I don't know that they're allowed anywhere else on the island. You know, on-leash dogs are fine. Off-leash dogs are okay in northwest and southeast, but I would also mention that the city code has a separate dog thing that says off-leash can be in these, I don't know, 5 or 6 specific areas. And somehow that would need to be reconciled with what we're saying in the open space code. Trails are permitted, art is permitted, stormwater mitigation is permitted. And in fact, in trails, the master plan has like 4 categories of trails depending on the permeable surface or not. And where those can be located. So I don't know, are we trying to come up with these are okay and those aren't? Because what I'm concerned about is forgetting something. That, and the process is so cumbersome to fix it. I'm a little concerned about that. I think we should have a laundry list. But like I said before, I think the laundry list should be the laundry list, but then specific parks or open spaces might have 3 of the laundry list, but not 12 of them.
Yeah, I think for tonight's purposes, I think it's really getting down to what does the group think from a consensus perspective should be approved uses. And you're right, there's going to be a lot of nuance, but I don't think we're going to solve that issue tonight. I want to get back to wireless just to put a bow on that. And I think Councilmember Anderell had a question or comment, excuse me.
I did. I think Jesse's going to personally escort me off the island now. But I wanted to point out that there may be city uses that for wireless facilities, whether they're communication facilities or not. I mean, we've had a lot of citizen input about where we site our poles for collecting the water meter data. There may be some down the road, some emergency communications where, some of these open spaces are some of the highest ones on the island and it would be important. So I think, and those would not be required by law. So I kind of caution on Dawn's, what I otherwise liked, your idea. But then when I started thinking about what about our own uses, and I know, sure, we would probably put that as the lowest priority place to put it, but if we need it, we need it. So.
You can say.
Okay, any other final comments on wireless? I think that we've got a pretty good idea of where we need to be. And we'll just kind of wait and see what comes back in a couple of weeks and then we can look at specifically at the issue. All right. So Trustee Bender kind of gave a laundry list of things.
Yeah, I had some additions. So one of the things that Trust Board has also talked about is what kind of sort of mugging around in the park is allowed. So we would allow educational and scientific investigations, but not mucking around.
How about
Yeah.
picnicking? Other than at the corner of.
I think what we should possibly do is brainstorm a list of allowable uses.
Right.
And I will tell you that it's okay to be, down in the weeds. We're gonna take all of this and restructure. And what I want to do before we leave this topic is make sure there's an agreement with the list. So it's okay if you put dog walking on the list. It may not end up in the code. It will be represented somewhere, but I want to make sure if there's pressure points anywhere that we address them. Sam is ready to scribe if we, and I apologize, Marie, we weren't writing when you were talking earlier, so we may have to go back to your brainstorm a moment ago.
My suggestion is read the Pioneer Park Master Plan, because all of this came out of there. And just to respond to dog walking, it's okay to leave it maybe where it is in the code right now, but it doesn't cover enough open spaces that need to be, like there's the 53rd open space trail. That follows a creek. No dog should be off leash there, but it's allowed right now.
If Marie is talking about updating the leash law, then she has to get voted off the island.
Well, Councilmember Reynolds.
For our esteemed legal colleague, and I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on television, but from what I understand, there are kind of two types of philosophies. One is everything that is not prohibited is permitted, and the one that is everything that is not permitted is prohibited. So which system do we have here? Are we listing permitted uses, or could we easily approach this to list prohibited uses?
Councilmember Reynolds, it's a good question. Again, I'm going through this particular portion of your code, and it appears to, and again, I'm in 1906, and it appears to specifically call out, permitted here, and then here's what your design standards look like. Can only be X feet tall, that kind of thing. So it appears, at least for this section, and again, is subject to check with Allison. It appears that you list it, and if you don't list it, it's prohibited. So,
Yeah, and that's consistent throughout our code, our development code. We permit uses explicitly, and if they're not permitted, then they're prohibited.
I started thinking about this in the context where Trustee Bender mentioned dog walking, a very reasonable thing to want to allow, at least in many of the open spaces. What if I want to walk my cat? It doesn't say that. Does it need to?
I mean, usually we're talking about land uses. So those would be things like permitting certain types of buildings or permitting certain types of development structures, things like that. It doesn't typically relate to those sort of passive uses of people walking across with a pet.
and perhaps, and I apologize, I misunderstood your question earlier, Councilmember Reynolds, but this may get into the details of what should be in the zoning code and what should be in the park rules. So I agree with Deputy Director Van Gorp, but no cats could be a park rule or an open space rule, perhaps.
Pardon me. And
Go
I
ahead.
didn't wait to be recognized, but thank you. What's going into the code is as a description of the zone should be very specific legal language, and it should be at the same time very, very general. And this distinction between the park rules versus the zoning definition is a very important one. So I think that developing a laundry list of permitted uses is a great way of brainstorming what we consider to be appropriate for uses of open space. But when it comes down to it, I despise laundry lists in legal language, and I would like to distill that into something that we can agree upon as being the essence of open space. And if we can do that, then we give the flexibility of the governing board that's responsible for some of those open spaces at least to write the detailed rules and decide whether cat walking is okay. So yes, let's proceed with producing the list, but let's try to distill that when we come to writing the actual language for the permitted uses in the zone.
So Thomas, just to kind of follow on to that, so kind of having this kind of tiering, could you have would your thinking be like in the development code? You could say kind of, I'm not sure the right term, but let's say low impact activities. And then in the park rules, you could actually go and then define exactly what you mean. And because then if you want to, because that obviously park rules are much easier to change going forward as, behavior changes, if you will. Is that something you're thinking about?
Can I attempt an
Oh,
example?
Sure.
An allowable use would be trails. That probably fits in open space zone. The next section in development regulations, we would maybe describe what types of trails would be allowed if we want to get that detailed. And then the park rules would talk about if cats are allowed or not allowed to use those trails, right? So we would say, yes, you can have trails. The trails are only 6 feet wide. I'm making that up. But no cats are allowed. Sorry, Councilmember Reynolds, we're gonna be playing on this. Should I write cats on our recommendation list over here?
Only a hypothetical question.
Okay,
so-
okay. All right, we're having fun.
Thomas, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate on that a bit. The idea that when we're talking about zoning, we're talking about land uses is important. Obviously, building a trail is a land use. Building a drinking fountain or a bike rack is a land use. And in developing this description of what is permitted within the zone, we should compare with the descriptions that we already have for other zones and say, okay, it specifies what kinds of buildings we can put here. So our description of the open space zone should be something about its physical use. Not perhaps its incidental use, but how is it going to be developed? Since I think that's what generally zoning codes are about.
You're hired. Absolutely, that's absolutely right. Yeah, you're back on the island. You're back on the island. So would you like to attempt the list of allowable uses?
That's what we're talking about.
All right, Sam started over here, trails, bike rack, furnishings. Off the island.
I'd be in,
Would you like to talk about utilities before we do our list? And then maybe we can take a short break? Would you? All right, I asked Elaine to give you a flyover of what type of utility activity is happening in your open space areas, and there is some.
Well, thank goodness for GIS, because I actually can look at exactly where our utilities are in our existing open spaces. We have quite a bit of utility infrastructure actually within our open spaces currently. So the ones that we're talking about here today, and I will call out a few of them because you may not know about them. They're underground and probably not visible under leaf litter and things like that. Really, the only time that you know that they're there is when a crew shows up to do some work on them. One of the examples is in the northeast quadrant of Pioneer Park, just across the bridge. It's sort of an Engstrom open space over there. There's a significant sewer pipe that runs down through the ravine from the north and comes out and meets up with East Mercer Way. Another example is in Mercerdale Hillside. We have some sewer infrastructure that runs down the north boundary of the park. And this is one of those cases actually where it may have been originally unopened right-of-way that was tacked onto the open space. So, there may be various histories about why there's that infrastructure in the parks, like sewer or water infrastructure. I think the other one that you see really commonly, and you probably would expect more in open spaces, is stormwater infrastructure. So that may be construction that's happened to reinforce a water course, which is actually part of our stormwater conveyance system, re-engineering log jams and things like that. But it could also be more artificial infrastructure like piping. So there's an example from 2015, where a large stormwater pipe was actually put into Upper Luther Burbank Park. It's very overgrown now, so you probably haven't seen it. But this was due to the fact that a lot of the upstream basin in the area had been hardened, and there was a lot more stormwater rushing into that open space, which was causing a great deal of erosion in those water courses. So that's just an example. I just want to kind of give a few examples of existing infrastructure, utility infrastructure that's in our parks. And I'm happy to answer questions about it, or at least I can try. So.
Questions? I have a question. So, I mean, you talked about the existing utilities, kind of just thinking going forward. I mean, do you expect a lot of new utility activity given the mature nature of most of these properties or not?
I think that's a really hard thing to speak to, but I will say this. These generally aren't the favored areas for putting in new utility infrastructure. I'm not going to say never because that's a terrible idea, but you know, there's existing and mature canopy in a lot of these. And if there is a way to avoid ever removing trees in open space that are healthy in any way, that has clearly been our priority. So, but you know, there may come times, especially in these areas, like I just mentioned about Mercerdale Hillside, where the open space took over the unopened right of way, which had been a utility corridor. So there, you know, there could be times when that's true. So, you know, no, there are no plans, but that doesn't mean there wouldn't be a need at some point because putting it elsewhere actually causes more damage in some way or
Yeah,
more
thank you. That's
displacement.
helpful. I think it helps kind of size the issue. But I think kind of going back to our wireless discussion, if there is a need for a utility, I mean, is there other sections of the code that say, well, it's got to go there? Or can we essentially forbid them, any new construction of it? I'm just trying to understand what prerogatives we may or may not have.
I'm trying to think off. I haven't looked at the sewer code recently enough. I'm not sure what it says about citing utilities.
I'm
Allison.
certainly not an expert on the sewer code, but it typically comes down to, you know, the engineering and where facilities are needed. You know, if someone's building a new house on vacant land, they're often tripping thresholds in terms of land disturbance and new impervious surfaces that would require them to put in stormwater detention and conveyance. And so then that stormwater needs to be connected into the system somewhere. They'll need to, you know, extend side sewer piping to connect to wherever the stormwater mains might be. And so, you know, I think the city engineering team works with development projects to figure out, you know, the best way to engineer those systems. And then on the city's end, you know, as we're managing stormwater conveyance, you know, they're looking at how the system's performing and whether it's got enough capacity. And if new development is happening in a certain area or neighborhood, you know, it can get to a point where it trips the need for upsizing the system. And so that's all going to be based on, you know, the kind of the engineering needs of what's happening out there. And so I don't think there's anything in the code that requires stormwater or other utilities to be placed in a certain location. It's more based on the need and the performance of the system.
I'm not sure we can answer your question about future needs very easily.
Yeah, but I guess maybe the essence of the question then is kind of given Allison's comments there is that do we need to have a utilities component or authorize a permitted use for that, for whatever the future may hold, or could we say we don't want any period? And I see Trustee Hildebrand.
Yes, just an observation that it probably doesn't explicitly state in the zoning code where the establishment of utility rights of way is permitted use. So what I'm getting at is that it may be orthogonal, it might be on a different plane from the considerations that are taken in zoning considerations. Just as an example, I know that there's a stormwater drain from my house that runs down to the lake. It runs all across private property. Did they have to apply for a permit to allow stormwater to go through their property? No. Is the land specifically zoned to allow stormwater to go through? No. Is there an explicit easement for the stormwater to go down that way? No, I don't think so. So one way, I'm speaking from ignorance, but you could handle utility rights of way through easements, but I don't think that there are explicit easements in all cases for this type of infrastructure. So it may be kind of moot in the current discussion.
Here's what I will offer. Why don't you let the staff do some more work on the utilities? And I'd like, so follow-up question for the attorney, not for this meeting, is, what would need to be included in the code to address the current utilities land use, of which there is quite a bit? And then what would we add to the development regulations portion of the code to place reasonable limits on that, if that works? We'll work on it.
Yeah, this will definitely need some study. This is definitely something that most codes frankly don't touch much, but then when they do, usually when they do, we find out because there's a problem. For example, with all of the AMI deployment, right? We ran into some snags there. So we'll work on this. It's going to be striking a balance between, protecting open space, but then also giving us the flexibility to change as needs change. And with utilities especially, it's like a technology change, right? You're trying to foresee the future and not box your hands in. If we have a better way to figure out when there's like a sewer main break, which you would want to know about ASAP, obviously.
Thank you for that. Another topic that we probably need to think about is parking. And maybe I'll ask either the city manager or one of the city staff perhaps to talk. Today, is there any designated parking in open zoned, or what we consider these areas that are going to be zoned open space? I mean, obviously there's a lot of, I'll call it adjacent street parking available, but as far as designated parking, whether for ADA or otherwise.
I will ask Elaine Summergren again to share the parking woes of the open space system, what's happening out in the field now. I will remind you all, when we did the pros plan, and I wish Rory was here because I remember he talked a lot about parking. Just because it's not there now doesn't mean it may not be needed. And Elaine can share with you some of the operational issues. But we had certainly flagged ADA accessibility, which, by the way, would allow for an accessible parking spot in most of these areas, regardless of our code. Anyway, and I can go pull on the pros plan where we talked about parking, but Elaine, did you want to talk about what's happening right now with parking?
I can certainly address what's happening right now in general with the properties that are listed here tonight. I can't think of any of them that have any designated parking or designated ADA parking. Can you, Sam?
Think maybe in the Pioneer plan, there might be some.
Right. So in general, at open spaces, it is either on-street parking that's adjacent to the parcels, or what's more common is that it's off-street parking adjacent to the road. So what happens usually is that this is the equivalent of a social trail, right? People park where they feel they need to park. And a lot of times what that does is it affects the vegetation that was growing there, ending in soil compaction, turning to mud, and then the city putting gravel on top of it to deal with the mud issue. And so it's actually encroaching into those open space areas. Some of you may have seen a recent example at Pioneer Park where that parking area was reclaimed and put back into restoration. But that's a really common way that parking is dealt with because there's no designated parking at these properties. And clearly a desire for people to go hiking in them.
So what are people's thought about designated parking within open spaces? Given the comments from Elaine about kind of how it's handled today.
If I
Maria.
may, I think one question would be, should parking be an allowed use? Yes or
Right,
no?
yes.
And then part two is under what restrictions?
So I mean, there's an obvious need for parking. So for example, when I want to use the 53rd Street Trail, it is dangerous to park there. It's a very busy road. So I think we need to think about how to provide some limited parking for almost all of the open spaces. But I do think we ought to talk about permeable surfaces. So gravel, not cement or tar. I also think in like Mercerdale Park, there's no reason to put Mercerdale open space parking in. It should specify, to the extent it's adjacent to a recreational park, it should be on the recreational park property and located in a way that doesn't impact like the edges of an open space. But there are some open spaces that it may be, I don't know, not possible.
Right.
It may be that access should be by trail. So I don't know how you build into the code that says there's a hierarchy of decision-making that's required before you allow parking. I guess that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Commissioner McCarthy.
Thank you. So I did go, Jesse, and I read through the pros plan since our last meeting. And something that I found interesting was in chapter 5, when it's got the classifications and inventory, and it explains what the different parks are, and it's got the sizes of the parks. And I'm just wondering if that's something that we could use. So it's got like regional parks and those are the bigger parks. And so more people go. And then it's got neighborhood parks and explain, that's mostly for the people that live around that area, and then mini parks. So I'm just thinking if we did something, potentially with open space where you have the tinier little open spaces, and those would be considered mini parks. And so, the parking, and it would be more thought of as that is a local one that you are going to be walking to more often than not, and sort of look at it that way with the sizing of the parks or the open spaces to sort of think about the parking that way. Similar to what Marie was saying about some should only be, got to by trails.
Other thoughts?
Is it
sorry.
reasonable to list the specific open spaces that we would allow some type of parking in? We could just say Pioneer Park and this would take a deeper dive to look at which ones really need some sort of limited parking.
Well, and it
It-
can accommodate.
And can accommodate it, right? If most of these can be accessed by trails, then we just specify a couple of these open spaces. I'm thinking of Pioneer Park in particular, where a small amount of limited parking is really needed for people to access Pioneer Park.
Trustee Olson.
I think we're fortunate that Pioneer Park has all these streets adjacent to it, and the right of ways are quite large. I think they're 60 feet or something like that. Anyway, we've got one, 84th paved, nice long area for people to park on. There's no prohibitions. We just try to, like Elaine said, we try to keep them off the grass. And the alternate parking space is Starbucks and QFC. Anyway, there's a lot of potential for just widening the areas. I think it's on, 68th, where there's on the south part of the north east quadrant, there's some gravel pullout areas where people park. And so there's some opportunities where it's not actually in the park. It's still within the right of way. But we try to keep the, all the vegetation as much as we can, even within the right of way.
So it sounds, I think there's some sense that, yeah, for certain areas, limited parking is a possibility, but I think there's also probably, in many of the areas, it doesn't make sense because it's just, there's not enough room. It's not, and perhaps usage as well, just from the size of the park. So I don't know if that gives you enough guidance or not.
I think we can take a stab at it. I want to go back to what Commissioner Hay said. The tool that you referenced in terms of, making a list, it's what I call table format in zoning. And we're trying to move away from that in our code only because it's really hard to maintain. Like every time you add a property, you've got to go repopulate those tables. But I think where you're headed, and I'd like to take a stab at it for the next meeting, is to try to define what makes a property suitable for parking and how much, and see if we can get our arms around that. So before we move off of parking, because this was definitely one of the hottest topics when this draft rolled out, can you think of anything else we haven't talked about? Like obviously we have some open space with steep slopes. We're not going to put parking there. I'm thinking Pioneer Park, we have right-of-way parking. We do get complaints about it not being safe enough, but we can do things to make it safer. We may need an ADA parking spot. So we wouldn't want to go carve out, cut down trees and build parking when you have sufficient right-of-way right next door. So there's a proximity thing. That's whoever was just talking about Mercerdale. Anything else? Am I triggering any other ideas that we can?
You're triggering one for me, which is, and something Marie mentioned, the adjacent public right of way, what it looks like, how much available it is. So I know we have parked at down by the bridge, the shoulder's pretty wide there, but East Mercer Way generally is not good for parking. But if we can reference somehow the adjacent street system.
If you have any other ideas about parking or things that restrictions, I sure hope you'll just shoot me an email because we're going to be tinkering with this language. And I can't remember who just mentioned the size of the open space. I wrote that down. I think that would, Jody, thank you. That might be something that we'll take a look at too.
Yeah, like if something like if it's less than 3 acres or something, that's considered, a mini or whatever.
Or
And
you
so-
might express it as a percentage.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
No more than
Yeah.
3% of the property can be devoted to parking. That would automatically rule out a parking spot in all of the smaller open spaces.
Right.
And also it would have to be level. Yeah.
Peter?
Commissioner Cohen.
Two thoughts. One, city manager, do you want to get into above ground, below ground, all of that sort of stuff, or is that next? That's my second question. My first question is, which of these properties on the list here are problem areas today as far as parking is concerned? Because the point about Pioneer Park along 84th is a good one. I'm not sure that is a problem one, although you said that there are some safety concerns. Well, I go by there all the time and there's cars, a lot of them sometimes, a lot, not all the time. And if there really aren't problems, let's not necessarily try to solve it by adding parking any more than any of these other things that we know that some citizens don't want if they're not required by law. Like, I'm not talking about ADA issues, so.
Elaine, off the top of your head, any open spaces that are causing grief with parking? I know the future development of Hollerback is something that we're really going to have to, do you want to talk about that? And
I certainly can. So Hollerbach open space is essentially sort of locked in, right? It's a bowl within a purely residential area that we really have very limited access to right now. And all of it is between parcels, very narrow, either easement or very small spaces between parcels. And there really is no obvious place for parking at any side of Hollerbach currently.
Unless you bushwhacked down from, what's that, from 91st?
Right. I mean, you would have to walk through city streets essentially to find parking and then try and find your way in there. And that will become an issue when we actually develop a trail system in there, which has been on our out year CIP plan for, I think, a couple biennia now. So one thing that I wanted to mention, just because of the ecologist in me, I'll just say this for consideration, which is that while on its face, off-street parking into open spaces may feel okay or it's level, I think figuring out how you want to deal with that, and this may not be zoning, this may be a more granular look at it than this, is that one of the benefits of open spaces is that there's undisturbed land in the middle, which is really the prime habitat for animals and plants. And it's called the edge effect, right? So as much edge as you have, there's a certain level of effect from that, whether it's heat or noise, water infiltration. And so when parcels are carved up more and more, you get very little of that in the middle. Even in Pioneer Park, we have very little in the middle. And so while that 10, 15, 20 feet of parking into the vegetated area may seem like a small chunk, it actually has a very big effect on the effect of the ecological function in that park. So just for consideration. And then I think the other consideration is about surfacing. There's a big difference between paved surfacing or gravel surfacing. Maybe it's just dirt. So just other things to think about with parking as near open spaces.
Yeah.
In areas where we have paved roads and wide shoulders, certainly a very different thing to talk about.
Yeah. Trustee Abby.
I think something to keep in mind is the proposal for the Island Crest corridor. Your mic. Oh, sorry. No. The Island Crest corridor expansion and the interconnection of bike transit around the island. And so that's going to be a very important consideration for us in terms of accessibility to our open spaces and the idea of, reducing some of the pressure or need for car parking, I think might be alleviated given the potential for the bike lanes. And so some of that can be addressed. We put a bike rack in Pioneer Park, and if we can make that part of a standard practice in open spaces to address accessibility, then that might be a really important consideration, but also a very real possibility.
And Commissioner Cohen.
To Marie's point, the 53rd place trail is the one that needs parking, but there's nowhere to put it. So, let's not spend a lot of time on it. No, I'm not criticizing you, but it's a good reminder. Yeah.
It really feels like the theme here from all of you is less is more on the parking.
Yep.
It might need to be an allowable use, but I think there's some code language we can write around preferring adjacent right away, not disturbing any habitat, the surfacing. I wanted to mention in the pros plan discussion, the concern with the entire park system was that many of our neighborhoods are not within walking distance of a public park. And that, as we wrestled with parking during that discussion, it was to make sure that our spaces are accessible. But I do think what you're saying is open space has another purpose as well. And so I'm happy to say we'll attempt it. We'll attempt it based on this great discussion. And I don't think any of us intend to write something that provides for 4 brand new parking spots in every parcel. If you have anything else to add to that.
I have one question. I would like to know if the places where people are parking now, are they in open space or are they fully in right of way? So when I was talking about needing parking at Pioneer Park, I'm talking about the places where people are already parking. They park in the dirt by the four-way stop. They park along the road. They used to park all the way down. Now they park partway down, stop in the middle, more parking beyond that. So where those cars are parking now, do we need to say parking is allowed and then, and somehow you put some gravel down, kind of carve that out as or are we going to say can't park there at all? And then you've got a lot of people who can't access the park anymore, especially considering the QFC Starbucks area, that it does get full. And if that ever changes, I hope it doesn't, but if that changes and the type of parking we have in that area changes, then you've got no parking, no way to access Pioneer Park. So are they parking in the right of way or are they parking in half right of way, half open space? And what do we do about that?
Yeah, so I think most of the time it is actually technically right of way, but like I was saying with Mercerdale, Pioneer Park extends all the way to the road edge as in terms of a park boundary. We could talk about that. That's a whole different subject. I don't know that it's really about taking away those. It may be about delineating the parking in a way that makes it very clear and where it's not allowed. So, for example, when you go up Island Crest Way a little bit farther north into the next quadrant, we have people pull off there into the grassy area and then it gets very muddy and then it's very hard to reclaim that. So that's more of what I'm talking about than pulling back on things that have really well established as parking areas. I think there is a lot of history for parking Pioneer Park, even Southeast 53rd, actually, quite a bit of parking along the lower portion of that road. So it may just be about
Both.
formalizing it.
It's both, right? We've
Yeah.
got right of way parking and then over the years with Pioneer Park, the cars start creeping into places they're not supposed to be.
Yep.
That's what Elaine was talking about earlier. Then we have to go and restore those areas and do creative things to discourage it.
Right.
And that's,
It's more about the creep.
yeah, the creep.
Okay. Councilmember Reynolds.
Comment and one question. Perhaps my comment by saying, yes, with everything tonight.
Oh, is your mic on?
A comment and a question, and with all my comments, I'm not trying to suggest direction, just things to think about. And one is that we've been talking about parking for a while now. I think you should probably clarify what you mean by parking. I'm assuming that refers to automobile parking. And the question is, should bicycle parking be allowed? And I think that's a topic you should address because people ride bikes to get to park sometimes too. And you may want to treat it the same or treat it differently, but you should probably think about that. And the question I had was, we had a couple of comments made about impermeable surface. And my recollection from reading the code a long time ago is that gravel in a parking strip per the code, at least in other places, is considered impermeable. And I want to just get confirmation if that's true or not.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
I'm looking at trustee Bender. In your list was bicycle parking, like bike racks. I mean, it was mentioned. Is that permitted already in the? Pioneer-
Bicycles are already permitted in Pioneer
Well,
Park.
bicycles, but
But
bicycle.
and we
bike-
did 2 years ago, install a bike rack just so people can
Okay.
actually do something with their bicycles. And I think Hillary is absolutely right. We should be encouraging that in other open spaces. I'd much rather have bicycles coming in than cars.
So is that something the group would think is a good permitted use is appropriately, bicycle racks
On the perimeter.
on the perimeter? Yeah.
And something that Councilmember Reynolds raised in my mind is this idea of parking as for use while you're using the park, the open space. It's not parking for anything else. And yeah.
Commuter or whatever. Okay. Other permitted uses one can think about? Sure, yeah. So I show 6:57, so let's reconvene at 7:10, so 13 minutes. Thank you.
She just promises a break.
Yeah, yeah. We are back in session. Thank you very much for. We're continuing on with permissible uses, and behind me on this one, I'll read them off, but we just listed a few that maybe we can talk about. The first one is buildings and open spaces. A couple examples being potentially restrooms and, for example, maintenance sheds. And maybe what I thought I would just start out with is if city staff could just maybe talk to, are there any restrooms in open space designated areas and or maintenance sheds? Again, the future is the future, but just kind of, has there been a need expressed for them at this point? And then we can.
I will let Elaine talk about maintenance sheds and existing restrooms. I do want to point out, when we did the pros plan, we did a couple different community surveys. And in the top 4 consistently was the need for more restrooms in our park system. And I think it applies, well, I'm a mom of young kids. I can't tell you what a pain in the rear it is to pack everyone up and get to Pioneer Park and then we have to go to the bathroom. So that was a common theme, but we don't actually have very many restrooms system-wide. So Elaine, do you want to talk about where we've got sheds or other types of buildings in our open space systems, how they're used? And I'm drawing a blank. I don't think we have any restrooms right now.
So really,
One-
we only have one restroom right now, and that is a portable toilet in Pioneer Park, which is in the southeast corner of the northwest quadrant. But that is the only open space that we currently have that's restroom. I actually can't think of any other structures, sheds, anything like that. We do have occasionally some job boxes in our parks for volunteer use or for seasonal use, but really the only thing that we have up right now is that portable toilet, which has been there, as far as I know, for about 20 years.
One more quick question. At one point, we had talked about staging equipment in Pioneer Park in the event we had a fire. That was talked about with our fire department.
We do not have anything of that nature.
Okay, with that background information, thank you very much. Thoughts on having restrooms as a permissible use for I guess for the future, really? Trustee Bender.
So I think we can draw on what we've already done, which is a small open space doesn't need a restroom. We've had a number of discussions with the trust board about the bathroom in Pioneer Park and debated whether it should be a permanent structure, and if so, what should it be? I'd like to talk about compostable toilets as an alternative to that portable, which it gets used, and I do see it serviced from time to time. What I don't know is whether it's actually serving the need, as opposed to just using occasionally. But I don't know, I think recreational parks are different from open spaces in terms of the time spent there.
Agreed.
And the purpose for being there is very different from going to a park and using the merry-go-round. So I guess I would put a very high threshold on a permission for a restroom. And then I would have it limited to, I think portables are ugly and we have a little bit of fencing around it to try to disguise it not very well. So there needs to be some concept of, if it's going to be there, it needs to be designed in such a way that it actually does blend into the natural environment and be on the exterior, presumably, if we could, in the right of way.
Okay. I like your comment about, being a permissible use, but with a kind of a quote unquote high threshold, which, that would be something that would have to get worked out. But do others think of that, or others say no way, no how?
I don't think it's necessary.
Okay.
We don't have it now and I don't see a need for it.
I have to disagree because the Pioneer Park portable gets used quite a bit. It is a large park with lots of access, walking, biking, driving and parking, and it's a heavily used park. So that is one park out of all of these that I could see some type of facility being there. Whether it needs to be a permanent facility, I would think not, because that takes a lot of infrastructure to support that. It would be very disruptive in the park as well. If there is something that is more amenable to the area, would be good. Compostable, I don't know how those work, but that sounds like a great idea. But from someone who walks in Pioneer Park regularly and whose wife uses that portable regularly, it is very heavily used from what I can tell.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I will echo what both of you have said. I agree at a high threshold. It feels like it could be a permitted use and totally a second Paul's comment also that I've seen it used quite a bit. So that one, at that one part. So.
Can I ask a question? So are we talking about buildings?
No.
Okay, so I thought we were talking about buildings, restrooms. So I do not think we need building facility restrooms. What you're talking about, I think, is fine, but we would need to describe that in a different way so that it's not a building.
So I put that up there. Under the category of buildings, there are two types of buildings that would likely be up for discussion for inclusion in open space. And so it's nothing more than the restrooms and the maintenance shed. It sounds like there's a scalable Pioneer Park probably needs a permitted use for restrooms because of its size. I would tend to agree. I think the businesses next to the park would also appreciate us continuing to address that. But maybe the other properties not sized big enough to warrant that type of infrastructure.
Oh, sorry.
I'd like
Yeah.
to point out that a portable toilet is not a building. So in terms of land use, it would be permitted because you're not building a building. And it sort of, currently it's up to the OSCT board to decide whether we're going to let the portable be there and where. So that I think is sufficient.
Okay, good differentiation there. Marie?
I would just disagree a little bit. The portable is ugly. And in my mind, it's as much a building as anything with a foundation. And I would much rather see a beautiful wood-clad square that was a compostable toilet there than what we have now. So I would hope at least we put a permission level that would allow people to make a decision between ugly portable and, you know, wood-clad square like this.
Okay,
Elaine had a phone.
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to
Oh,
give a tiny bit of history there, and I think that Commissioner Cohen will remember this also, is that over the years, the trust board has contemplated on and off putting in a legitimate restroom in the northwest quadrant of Pioneer Park. We have looked at different models. It has come on and off the work plan. The main issue there has been that there is not sewer infrastructure that runs there currently, and so it would be maybe a larger project. But just to give some history that has been contemplated several times by the trust. Right, so exactly. So Sam just brought up that compostable has some conflict with other code provisions. So the question was, you know, what infrastructure would be needed to actually run sewer into the park to support such a facility?
You read my mind, but also, you also probably remember that at least we got a brown color portable rather than the original light teal color one. That was a major improvement.
I had to fight tooth and nail for that. Is it green now? We've gotten into it with some portable toilet companies in the past about that.
So it sounds like that, again, we would allow these again, on a, but there would be a high threshold. And I guess I'm not sure how you phrase that, but I think that's the.
We'll attempt some code language
We can look at
for you
that.
all. And I think the allowable use is the restroom, probably the trust would have to continue to arm wrestle over the details of how that applies to the properties they steward.
Okay,
Just for the record, Peter,
Yeah.
I would not be in favor of putting a sewer line in the park.
okay. Understand, thank you. All right, maintenance sheds are kind of along the same lines. Again, there's none now, but you never know what the future may or may not bring. Thoughts on that?
And this, if maintenance sheds are included, it's implying that these would be permanent. Because I think we can sufficiently stage tools and things for temporary needs. So the question is, would that be an appropriate use of your open space? Is that something you, and by the way, I'm not sure the staff have a strong opinion on this. We mostly truck all our materials back and forth. Sam wants to say something?
Yeah, Sam Harb, Parks Operations Manager. To the camera. I would just say that for areas that we've changed or that, the amenities that are changing, such as the bike skills area, that's a property that has potentially way different maintenance implications than, how it was before. So potentially that could be a need there, even though that's not being described as a open space at this time. But that kind of thinking could lend itself to leaving the option available in the future, like Hollerbach. If we do end up developing that into some sort of a boardwalk trail, then there could be some, structures that need materials stored on site or things like that that we don't really know about right now.
Commissioner Cohen?
With all respect to Sam, if you don't need them now, I wouldn't put them in. If you need it sometime down the line on a 5-acre parcel at Hollerbach, you'll figure out a way to get it there. I mean, we gotta listen to the community a little bit on this stuff too. The city manager said staff doesn't feel real strongly about it. That's good enough for me,
And I guess the one thing I would add is potentially, we're not talking about the recreation areas now, but the extent that, certain recreation areas, kind of need additional kind of maintenance just because of the nature of what they are. I almost think they could be kind of not co-located, but be co-used in terms of if there's a particular open space need, they could be used, out of a maintenance shed that would be in a recreational park. Again, there should be a high threshold for that, but that's to be discussed later. So, okay.
Council.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna lend my voice of support to Don Cohen's comment, and just the visual of a maintenance shed seems inconsistent with the type of ambiance we're trying to create in open space. I mean, maybe if you really desperately need it, you end up putting it on right of way, like we do the parking. But I wouldn't rush right in and say that's a permitted use or permitted structure. My opinion.
Thank you. Trustee.
Would it be possible for us to go ahead and consider, I think we have to consider like what the maintenance needs are of all these spaces and how varied they are. So for example, Hollerback open space has some really steep topography and I would anticipate warrant some pretty substantial tree work. And so that being the case, I wonder if it is going to be useful for us to, put in one of those clauses that says, why we might not want to have that be a blanket possibility for open spaces in general, that it might be warranted depending on the place that you're trying to manage. So the idea of bringing chainsaws in and out of a place like that is already really steep, just efficiency wise, might make sense. And I guess it would also depend on how extensive that trail system is, right? Is that going to be a really super high vis place, or is it going to be consistent with what I understand was the original envision, is that it was supposed to be like a connector system from open space to other open spaces. And if that's the case, I don't imagine it's going to be so many people just kind of standing there and hanging out, because it is very steep and almost entirely ravine. So I want to make a case for just putting in an exemption or like a consideration to, depending on what that open space is and what the maintenance needs are. Follow-up question, and what you just described, is that, do you feel like that's a permanent need or more of a temporary need? Like 6 months or less would be temporary in my mind. I don't know. Okay. I guess it would just depend on all of your impressions of how much actual tree work needs to be done, right? Because that area, like all of our areas, are dynamic, right? So I don't know if we can decide if that's going to be temporary, or we just have to see what that space tells us once we start working in there. I will point out my very bad handwriting over there that I wrote down temporary uses. And I think our code should say something about temporary uses, and that's where we should sweep up these things that are more transitional in nature, like work parties where we've got to bring out tents and we're doing a big thing and they're going to be up for a little while. Or what you just described probably falls under the guise of construction, where we're out, we're doing something big for a while, we're staging equipment, but it's not permanent. It's not permanently staged there. So that's what temporary uses refers to. It allows some flexibility to accommodate a different type of use for a short period of time.
And I guess I agree with that. I was going to ask Sam, kind of like the chainsaw example. I assume now they're probably stored at the main maintenance building, and then the crew in the morning would grab them and take them out to location A or B, and then they'd bring them back. And so having them at the south end, was that a big benefit or not really? Or I don't know.
Well, we have various like offsite storage facilities already. You know, we
Okay.
have South Mercer Playfields and Island Crest Park that has.
So in the developed parks.
You know, sometimes they have their own equipment stored there. I will say, you know, along these lines, our volunteer program is growing, and we cart around a lot of equipment for that. You know, as you know, forest stewards and some of the volunteer events get more common or just more routine, then maybe that could be a consideration for having more stuff stored on site. We have been able to get away with having like those lockable job boxes, you know, stored temporarily, and that's been fine for now, but you know, the need could change.
Okay. Thank you. So amenities, for example, signs and, oh, Donnie, you have something?
No.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Should sit back farther. So signs and kiosks, things like that, should those be permitted uses to have, I see a lot of people shaking their heads, okay. Unless somebody had,
I
Right.
have to say, the trust board is already discussing an educational program that we would like to initiate that would take advantage of those, you know, square code things. But post them in the park. There already are posts in the park that give you wayfinding in the park.
right.
So, I mean, I think they're fine, subject to being sized in appropriate ways and made of appropriate materials and be closely linked to the purpose of the park, which is, you know, open space, natural resources, education. And the same would be with stewardship. Stewardship, almost by definition, means pulling ivy or whatever. So I think as long as we keep close to the purpose, those are okay. I mean, the trust board had a considerable conversation about the peace pole that is there. And it was approved because it's small and because it had a close relationship to the culture of the island. So we need to be able to do something broader than it looks like a piece of outdoor art.
Right. Okay. Any other? Here.
So I hope it goes without saying that we wouldn't want to sell naming rights to a commercial.
Commissioner Cohen.
I've always been negative on signage, mostly because of signage creep. So I don't know, some way I'd like to limit it. I mean, I know that maybe in the rules or whatever it is, because I mean, you've got directional signage, you've got educational signage, you've got whatever else, whatever else there may be. And even if it's within the purpose, if you start getting, in my view, if you start getting too much of it, it detracts from the experience. And I don't know I know who's in charge of that from the trust, from Pioneer Park and Engstrom's point of view. It's the trust board. I don't know who's in charge of making those decisions in some of the other places. And so I guess I just want to want to say once again that too much is not good, in my opinion, in signage, even if the signage is linked to the purpose.
So in response to that, is there a way to write in signs and kiosks are permitted, but not, that they're not by definition permitted, just because they're small, if there's 7 others, we have to be able to say no. I'm sorry.
Okay. I just wanted to say, I liked Marie's idea about the QR codes because that's an opportunity for more people to get more information without it having to be a big, huge sign giving you all of that information. And that can be something that can be added easily to existing signs as well, for people to get the information without us having to change all of the signage.
So Jesse, I mean, I think we're getting the sense that yes, these things should be permitted, again, within a reason. And I guess that's kind of the question of whether that's something that would have to be within the park rules, or that's something we'd write into the zoning language, code language.
So just to reiterate, I heard Commissioner Cohen say bright rainbow, big signs, flashing lights.
Not we.
No, let me think about it. Commissioner Trustee Bender is making a good point that there's typically we write regulations to limit the number, like we don't want 16 kiosks at Pioneer Park, but 1 or 2 at key entry points would likely be appropriate. We'll attempt it.
Okay.
And by the way, everyone sitting here absolutely agrees with you on signage. And some of us, when we joined the city, we're scratching our heads. You know, the signage just gets layered and layered on, and we've been actively trying to do a sign diet, you know, consolidating where we can. So let us take a crack at that.
Thank you. Public art. Let the record show, no.
I don't know if the council member was joking or not, but I'm not particularly in favor of unlimited public art in these open spaces. I don't know whether it was a real comment or not.
No, I wasn't, I mean, I was trying to be funny, but I was also sincere.
Oh, okay.
I just don't, I think public art is great in parks and recreational areas, but it tends to distract from the natural ambiance and environment that I think we're trying to encourage in an open space.
Thank you. Trustee.
I'm sorry, I have to disagree. Mythic Bird has been in the park for a long time. It is deeply connected to our heritage of a place where Native people lived. At least that's my interpretation of it. And I would hate to think that it would have been turned down because it was art in the park. Now, location is important. It's on the edge of the park. And probably signs and kiosks, unless there's, I mean, like a wayfair needs to be in the middle of the park, but generally speaking, they should all be on the exterior. But I think that piece of art enhances the park. And certainly encourages people to spend a little time in that corner of the park, where we actually have a picnic table also.
Others have thoughts?
I'll chime in that I think public art should not be a permitted use. So in this case, the Mythic Bird would be handled as a non-conforming property. Sorry. straight out of the gate.
I think there are examples of other art in these open spaces. I can think of on Gallagher Hill at the bottom. By the street, there's some sculptures that are there. So I think art needs to be limited and it should be on the edge, but it should be considered. Because the reality with Gallagher Hill, there's a lot of traffic that's supposed to move slowly up the hill or down the hill. And that actually adds to the scenery as you're driving through, in addition to the open space. So I would prefer saying limited public art and only on the edge.
Okay, others, we kind of have a couple of different views here.
Does staff have other examples of art that is a discussion like this? I'm also thinking when you go across the lid from Upper Burbank Park to lower, there's that eagle, right? You know what I'm talking about?
We don't want to get involved in this discussion right now. We had, when we did the Aubrey Davis Park Master Plan, we had an exhaustive discussion about art. And the history of art on Mercer Island is that the art tended to look like a sculpture, right? And we joked that we were sculpture farming for decades on the island. And as we explored the opportunities at Aubrey Davis Park, we really looked at the Arts Council and recognized that art isn't just sculptures. Art can be a textured pathway, or it can be temporary art, you know, placement of leaves. I'm very bad at this, so bear with me. And the theme during those discussions, some of you were on the commission then, was we need to do more of that type of art and less sculpture farming in the parks. But still, you all have been very consistent in your comments this evening that natural is natural. And so some of what I just described, that was all included in the Aubrey Davis Park Master Plan. And Aubrey Davis Park is an active park. It's a different space. So I might ask you to wrestle this a little bit more. I think I'm hearing some folks say maybe on the perimeter. And by the way, if the Arts Council members are watching, I'm sorry I did such a terrible job describing art. I'll definitely work on that.
Okay. Councilmember Reynolds.
Expand on the city manager's comments. It seems like there are cases where art can come with function that might be appropriate to consider. So for example, if there's a bridge over a creek and you decide it's appropriate to put handrails on the bridge, there can be an artistic function to those handrails as well that, if done appropriately, is not detracting, but rather just makes it more attractive. And so that might be the sort of thing you'd want to keep in mind. Art for art's sake by itself might be inappropriate, but integrated art with structure that's required might be.
Paul?
Just to add on that point, talking about bike racks earlier, there are plenty of examples throughout the metro area that have beautiful bike racks that are very artistic. It's just not a straight structure. So there's another example of function with form.
Again, I'd like to point out that when we're talking about land uses, we're more or less thinking about permanent structures. So I would not consider a temporary art installation to be a permanent alteration of the land. And for example, the flight of birds at the bottom of Luther Burbank Park was intended to be permanent, but it could be pulled up after 10 years and that space be returned to its purpose as open space if that's the way it's zoned. So just to say that not calling out art as a permitted use doesn't exclude us from having art installations within our open space.
Well, and if I may, I would just say that decorative or, beautified bike racks or handrails would not to be constitute art, which because of their need to be functional, they can either be ugly or pretty. Just making them pretty doesn't make them prohibited as art.
Yeah, so I think maybe we're talking about standalone art at this point, and I guess if I can weigh in, I probably lean more towards not having them. I think, we have the recreational parks for that and so forth. Not that I don't like them, but if I had to vote, I would probably vote against nothing. All right, well, we'll see what the staff comes back with. You got enough, I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag, I guess.
You were doing so good
I
until we
know.
got to the art
I
discussion.
know.
I'm not sure I know, it's almost feels like you might be somewhere 50-50. I'm not real sure.
Well, let's do a thumbs up then. Thumbs down. Or let's just do a thumbs up. Who would like to see standalone art, probably, limited, probably on the edges of the park, if you will, or of the open space as a permissible use? I think that 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, is it? I don't know what, we got a couple of people missing, so I guess that's a slight majority. So. Oh, well, excuse me. I don't know, I was,
That's right, you do.
okay. Well, then it would be, I think it would be, then it'd be, yeah, it would be a tie. So.
Is this where I use my mom voice and say, I'm going to make you sit here and figure that? No.
Anybody have a friendly amendment as to how to break the log jam?
Well, we can let people who come next time wait.
Yeah, we were,
Put it in and we'll talk about it some more.
yeah,
We'll do some brainstorming as well. And
yeah, we can take a look at the language and,
The only thing I would add to that is a qualifier that it is of natural, yeah, everything that I think we have in open space now, like the birds, it has a very natural look that fits in with the open space environment. So, yeah, yeah, probably not. No.
the other thing I'm just going to say out loud here is Pioneer Park and Angstrom, from an art installation perspective, are attractive because it's a place where you can go see the art. That's sort of the point. Some of these other properties, that's not the case. And, the Arts Council is not sitting here tonight, but I know when they're talking about accepting pieces, that's part of the strategy is put it in places where it's accessible, viewable, experienced. So some of our open spaces are naturally limiting in that way. We will attempt to draft something up for you, and then I think we can anticipate further discussion on this.
Yep.
Okay.
okay. We talked about this, I think briefly, but just temporary uses. This could be like the city manager said, for organized events, any, I guess, a temporary art exhibit of some type, or maybe there's a couple of other examples you can think of. But
I'll share some thoughts here. So we will need to have a section here that describes temporary uses, and that's where we want to sweep up I think, who was using the word not mucking around earlier? Some of you maybe, are you familiar with the pumpkin walk? Okay, that originated in Pioneer Park, and we had to get it out of there because the event quickly became so popular, and that was not the way Pioneer Park was supposed to be used. So we moved it. It's moved a couple times, but it's in active parks now. So my opinion is those types of high use events are not appropriate for open space, but there's other times where we do have large number of people gather primarily for stewardship and volunteer events. But I was hoping tonight in this last area, you could help us brainstorm the type of activities and events that would be out of the normal, right? Not just people showing up to walk around, that we would need to make sure is reflected in this code. Anything besides what I just shared?
I think my co-trustees can chime in on this. I remember discussions that we put into our park rules about like runs. Would you allow a run in Pioneer Park? And we said no, but Was it Sam? Who was our staff person at the time? There's a table that shows number of people and what the permit fee is. So that's what I'm coming back to and thinking about runs, thinking about walks through the park, whether they're university classes coming out to view certain trees. Those were other examples of high quantity of people at one time that might come out.
Commissioner Bernstein.
I think, and I forget what it's called, but I think Lake Ridge in the beginning of the school year holds an annual event, get the kids out moving and meeting everybody. And they are going through Pioneer Park, if I'm not mistaken, at least one or two quadrants, maybe all three. So I don't know how we address that, if we allow something through the school district to be able to use the parks for their events.
Educational purposes, it
Yeah.
sounds like.
Yeah.
That's a little. I mean, size matters, and when we were talking on the board about groups of bicycles who wanted to come in and like teach skills, we were very concerned that you have to stay we had rules, you have to stay on the path and you can't have more than X number of people, and it has to be supervised. Now, seems to me like that's a rules issue, not a permissions issue, but maybe part of that belongs in the permissions side. And I mean, some of these things, I feel like we can't really enunciate them, because having enunciate them, we disallow other things. So what happens when a classroom wants to come in the park and bird watch and we didn't think to mention it? Or wants to come in and count caterpillars? So I don't know, you're gonna have, this is a sticky wicket.
Just to echo what you all are talking about in terms of educational use, I think it's so highly dependent, again, and this comes back a little bit to what Ashley was saying about the relative acreage of the kinds of parks and then the ecosystem functions of those particular places. So, for example, I live at Ellis Pond, and the environmental science class does water quality testing every year. And it's a number of classes and huge classes that come out there. And it's, it's not staying on the trail kind of situation. And so I wonder, like, in special cases like that, if we need to have specific uses about impact, even though, we want to support environmental education, and that's wonderful that we're engaging students to be involved in that. I think we do also need to address relative impact.
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think when in considering zoning, we're only talking about permanent alterations to the land. So in my view, all temporary uses are permitted or should be permitted by the code. And then it's up to rulemaking by the appropriate body to decide what size of group and structure and
Purpose.
oversight of the group and response to erosion we should put in place. So that's my view.
Okay, that sounds,
And I'm okay with that. I will say this, in terms of your open spaces, it helps us do our job if we outright, prohibit major events, because that's really not what your open space is for. So the reason we put a temporary use allowance in there is it's, let's say the UW is going to come out and do a 6-week tree assessment. They're going to bring out some structures that are going to sit there for 6 weeks and tents. We put that in the code, so it's allowable for a short period of time, but it gets removed. And it sometimes does matter in terms of the city's regulatory role if somebody complains. But I'm happy to take a look at that. I will say I am going to figure out how we prohibit things like summer celebration in Pioneer Park, because that's, I can't tell you how many times we get asked by outside groups to come and do something in one of our facilities. And if we can just say, not allowed, it does help us do our job at that level.
There are sections of the code that deal with nuisances and proper public behavior and so on and so forth. So it may not come down to a code issue.
Marie has.
I mean,
I guess my question is, what about item number 3 for discussion, which is regulations that detail what uses are allowed within the zone, such as fishing and wildlife habitat, not, I mean, are we skipping that? Is it not required?
Things like wildlife habitat.
Well, walking, nature observation, fishing, I mean, that's just a list, but I would put, you know, school kids doing scientific research in that. It's a permitted, it's use, not structure.
Here's what I'm going to attempt to do. That's going to sweep up all that. We're going to attempt to write something like in the allowable use section, passive recreation. And then Carson's writing it down so I don't forget. We're going to define what those words mean. And that's where I think we need to, when you see us next time, we're going to have to spend some time on the definitions. We will have flagged the items that need definitions. That way that allowable use section isn't 16 pages long, right? It's a little more focused. I saw some head nods when I was talking, so hopefully it's written in my head. We'll get it on paper.
Commissioner Hay.
Can we add low impact to that? We use that term a lot, passive and low impact in the pros plan. And thanks.
Okay, I think that takes care of that list. Yeah, sorry.
That is, I kind of browsed through the city code and there's a number of defined terms that need to get, so open space is defined, mitigation is defined, trees, both important and not important, and shrubs, all those things, at some point needs to be reviewed and said, okay, we're going to use it in the code. Does it make sense? Or do we have to alter the definition?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to put a little footnote.
Yeah. We will, to the best of our abilities, before you hand this off to the planning commission, do it and at least an initial assessment of where we have overlap and where we might have an inconsistency. And then as we work through the legislative review, we'll probably catch others.
Sorry, thank you.
Is transit stops anything that is relevant to open space, or is that more of the other parks?
Are you going off the island now, Dawn?
Well, no, I thought Peter was trying to end the meeting, and that was one of the things that we haven't talked about.
He wants to keep going. Transit stops, gosh, that was a nuclear item in the first round on this discussion. My 2 cents is leave it out. We've talked briefly about how to address it in the active parks. Most of our transit stops are in right-of-way. There's a few places where we might need to think through it a little bit. It's really Luther Burbank Park has an accessibility issue getting down the hill. I don't think it needs to be an allowable use in the open space zone. That's just my city manager perspective. Because the transit stop, if it's adjacent to Pioneer Park, which we have one, at least one, I think, 2 is in the right of way. Am I right? Yeah.
Okay, that's okay with me. I just didn't want to miss one of the things that we talked about.
Is there any other bombs you'd like to drop on the meeting right now, Commissioner Cohen?
right.
He's looking. No, he's looking.
See, I'm seeing names like Adam.
Okay, so there's 2 sections left, development standards and definitions. I'm going to ask the city manager, I think she's got a plan on how to work.
I have a plan. My plan is I think we should go home. What we've been doing is you've been talking about allowable uses. You've been sharing what that looks like to you. We're going to take that and put that into that development regulation section. So for example, restrooms, right? If it's an allowable use, it's got to show up with some guidelines in that development regulation section. So I don't know that we need to spend any more time on that tonight, but the next time you see us, that's where we're going to focus our time. You're going to give us the thumbs up, thumbs down, or some revisions based on what we've drafted. Does that work for everybody? And the same with definitions. We need to go write the text and then we'll figure out what needs to be defined, and we'd be happy to work with you on that further at the next meeting.
Yeah, so I think the next meeting where this one was very open, that one, you'll have a draft of specific language on a number of these issues and we can, I won't say wordsmith, but we'll go through them and get very definitive on that. So that's good. Going back to our script here, Park and Recs commissioners, are there any questions about the process to move forward with this issue specifically for the next meeting? Seeing none?
And we have the same question to the trustees. Any questions?
Okay, thank you. So the next regular Parks and Recreation Commission meeting is another joint meeting with the Open Space Conservancy Trust and is scheduled for Thursday, April 4th at 5 p.m. There being no other business to come before the Parks and Recreation Commission and the Open Space Conservancy Trust, the time is now 7:56 p.m. and the meeting is adjourned.
But as a reminder to commissioners and trustees, please stay seated until city staff has terminated the broadcast. Good evening and thank you for joining us.